An abridged audio production of the Dominica LGBT submission to the United Nations Commission for Human Rights, Universal Periodic Review 2014.
Miriam feels that no law or constitution should be allowed to discriminate against someone because of his or her sexual orientation. The anti-sodomy laws of Dominica are discriminatory towards the sexual expressions of consenting adults. Therefore, we feel that they should be repealed. They also fuel stigma and discrimination towards a minority in our society.
That's the view of Darrell Phillip, the coordinator of Minority Rights Dominica, called Miriam. This organization, in conjunction with Sexual Rights Initiative, has submitted a report to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights that will be presented to a session called Universal Periodic Review, UPR. This takes place in Geneva on 1st May 2014. So, what is the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR? Every 4 years, individuals or organizations of member countries of the United Nations have an opportunity to present to the UN Commission on Human Rights a report on any aspect of human rights violations that concern them. The report is then given a hearing in Geneva, attended by the UN ambassadors, who may question the relevant ambassador. In the case of Miriam's report, Dominica's ambassador will be expected to give the view of the government of Dominica. The purpose of the UPR is to encourage UN members to uphold the Human Rights Charter of the United Nations. The purpose of Miriam's submission is to encourage the Dominican government to take concrete steps to improve the environment for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, or LGBT populations in Dominica. But what is Dominica's relationship to human rights in general?
In 2011, Dominica signed onto a non-binding joint statement that seeks to end acts of violence and related human rights violations based on sexual orientation and gender identity. This was presented to the United Nations General Assembly. The statement expressed concern at continued evidence in every region of acts of violence and related human rights violations based on sexual orientation and gender identity. In some cases, this included killings, rape, and torture.
And what does Dominica's constitution have to say about discrimination in general and against sexual orientation in particular? Rasmo, an experienced social worker and performance poet, says,
"The Constitution of Dominica prohibits laws that are discriminatory and forbids the discriminatory treatment of individuals by any other person or authority. However, while it forbids discrimination on the basis of sex, race, place of origin, political opinions, color, or creed, it does not include other forms of discrimination such as gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity. In fact, in Dominica, where LGBT individuals suffer from high rates of HIV infection, abuse, and discrimination, the government has not implemented any measure to cater to their specific needs. This denies them the full enjoyment of their human rights as citizens."
And Dominica still has anti-buggery laws. Under the Sexual Offences Act of 1998, anal intercourse between a man and a man or a man and a woman is still punishable by a maximum term of 10 years imprisonment. We asked the former chief magistrate, who presently works as the director of public prosecutions, Evelina Baptiste, to concisely explain the act.
The Sexual Offences Act of the Commonwealth of Dominica defines sexual intercourse per annum by a male person with a male person or male person by a female person as buggery, and covers all forms of sexual intercourse per annum. Under Section 16 of the Act, buggery is punishable by a term of 10 years imprisonment when committed by adults, 25 years when committed by an adult on a minor, and 5 years when committed by a minor. The Act also gives the court discretionary powers to order that a person convicted of buggery be admitted to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. It is highlighted that Section 16 does not distinguish between consensual and non-consensual sex per annum and regards the person who engages in this form of sexual expression as having a mental disease.
What about the offense of gross indecency? What is that?
The Sexual Offences Act creates an offense of gross indecency at Section 14 criminalizes sexual act between females as well as between males. Gross indecency is defined under the section, that is Section 14.4, as an act other than sexual intercourse, whether natural or unnatural, by a person involving the use of the genital organs for the purpose of arousing or gratifying sexual desire. A person who commits such an act is liable to 5 years imprisonment on conviction. The only defense provided in the section is that the act of gross indecency was committed in private between an adult male person and a female person, both of whom consented. Therefore, same-sex sexual act are punishable by imprisonment under the Sexual Offences Act of Dominica.
The law cannot only punish people convicted under the anti-buggery laws by imprisonment. The courts also have discretionary powers to order that person to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. In fact, the law regards people who prefer this form of sexual expression as having a mental disease. We asked Dr. Griffin Benjamin, the consultant psychiatrist at the Ministry of Health, if homosexuality is a disease.
Homosexuality is not considered by psychiatrists or psychiatry practice as a disease because somewhere in the 1970s, I think at the level of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I think 2 or 3, it was changed. Initially, it was considered a mental illness, but I think somewhere in the 70s, it was changed and no longer considered to be any psychosexual or parasexual disorder.
If you were sent a patient for treatment as prescribed by the law, what would you do?
The court may send a person to the psychiatric unit or order that the person be admitted to the psychiatric unit for an assessment of his mental state. So the offense he may commit, according to the laws of Dominica, may be that of buggery. The court may send him for an assessment of his mental state. I have had the opportunity to offer treatment to individuals who I know to be homosexual or who tell me that they're homosexual, and the treatment offered to them is not for them to stop being homosexual. The treatment offered is for them to be able to cope with the social and other psychological problems that affect them in a society that is homophobic.
The review that Miriam will submit to the United Nations includes recommendations to change this discriminatory situation. What are its main recommendations?
We have declared in the report, and I read, that the government of Dominica should repeal those legal provisions on sexual offences which criminalizes sexual relations between consenting adults of the same sex and decriminalize sexual activities between consenting adults of the same sex immediately. Take all necessary measures to enact new legislation in order to protect and guarantee the enjoyment of fundamental human rights to LGBT people in all spheres of their lives, according to international standards.
What do these laws mean to homosexual people in Dominica? An executive of the Caribbean HIV/AIDS Partnership, CHAP Dominica, an LGBT organization in Dominica which focuses on HIV/AIDS education and prevention, says,
because of the existing criminal laws, many LGBT persons choose not to express or disclose their sexual orientation, and they are forced by social pressures to disguise or hide their orientation by entering into relationships with members of the opposite sex. Or the lesbians, I should say, dating men, and the gays dating women. This causes significant mental and physical distress that is not addressed by the health and social services because of the discriminatory laws that are on our books.
What about cross-dressers? People who were born male but dress regularly as females, and also women who were born female but dress regularly as males. How do they face discrimination?
There are a few cross-dressers who live in Dominica, born male but dress regularly as female because they identify themselves as female, and also vice versa, born female but identify themselves as men and thus dress as men. Male cross-dressers are referred to as Maku, and it's almost like a surname. This is a derogatory term. The cross-dressers suffer abuse, both verbal, mental, and physical abuse. Cross-dressing has traditionally been accepted as a source of entertainment during carnival celebrations, where men dress as women and women dress as men. But outside of that, it is seen as something bad, which has repercussions of violence.
How do the anti-burglary laws affect people who are campaigning in Dominica for human rights for homosexuals?
LGBT human rights groups in Dominica are forced to operate underground because of fear that their members may be victimized. Those who are openly gay complain of acts of abuse and are often victims of vandalism committed against their possessions, as well as being ejected from house and home. Reports made to the police are not taken seriously, and the victims are sometimes ridiculed. Through the systematic encouragement of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, the state have deprived individuals of their rights to freedom of expression and freedom of association.
What recommendations does Miridam's report make about this right to freedom of expression and association?
Miridam believes that the government should establish anti-discrimination laws and regulations to ensure that the LGBT individual enjoy equal rights. We would like the government to implement policies that address the needs of LGBT people, like inclusion in the gender policy and employment policy that address equality and follow international standards.
Another human right is the right to health. Julie Frampton is the coordinator of the Dominica National HIV/AIDS program. There is speculation that men who have sex with men, MSM, make up the majority of persons living with HIV in Dominica. Are there any prevention programs specifically targeted to MSMs?
One of the objectives as well is to reduce the number of MSMs involved in behaviors that present a risk of HIV and transmission. So what we aim to do with that is to provide ongoing support to MSM groups, particularly in areas of capacity strengthening, public relations and advocacy. And that is, we ensure that the services and as well as products in place to provide for MSM in reducing their risk. So in terms of condoms, in terms of lubricants, so we try and ensure that all this is in place.
So, is there an HIV/AIDS policy and has it been implemented? And if not, why not?
Yeah, we have guidelines for treatment. We have our treatment guidelines, but there's the national policy which was recently developed. It's not quite finalized. We have to take it back to the stakeholders for them to make their input. They were part of the input in the first draft. So when we have the final draft, we'll be taking it back to the stakeholders so they can make their input so it can be submitted in terms of how we provide care for everybody across the board.
What are the implications of this non-implementation? Darrell Phillip is concerned.
We are concerned that the state has not implemented any social adjustment programs aimed at reducing the stigma and discrimination that men who have sex with men face. Despite the AIDS epidemic plague in the Caribbean, such discrimination only serves to exclude individuals and encourage risky behavior. And we know from research that men who have sex with men are more likely to contract HIV than any other group.
So what are the report's recommendations about health and LGBT people in Dominica?
We want the government of Dominica to develop a sexual health program educating men who have sex with men so that they can protect themselves from contracting HIV and AIDS. We think that the healthcare providers should receive training to help them better understand the needs and sensitivities of HIV/AIDS patients.
Another professional service group that Miridam would like to see receive training on human rights and LGBT people is law enforcement officers. This is because the police are the frontline protectors of all citizens, but it appears that the safety of homosexuals is sometimes not taken seriously. There is evidence that discrimination against homosexuals affects economic performance in that homosexuals often feel marginalized at work and are the victims of bullying. Parry Bellot, the government's productivity consultant, says,
Education needs to be expanded. A lot of people don't go through full education cycles. We need to. So why we need to worry about educating them on tolerating and understanding others of a different sexual orientation? It's important because if Dominica is to progress, if we have to do more than progress but to prosper, we need all hands on deck. That includes all our working persons.
Apart from the problems affecting the health and economic well-being of LGBT people in Dominica, there is another fundamental area of discrimination for LGBT people. Their personal and emotional lives are restricted by Dominica's legislation. Darrell Phillip says,
In some countries, such as Canada, most of Europe, most of the United States of America and Latin America, same-sex couples can have their relationships legally recognized and so receive a range of benefits and rights. This is not the case in Dominica, where same-sex unions are not recognized. In fact, it is difficult to live openly as a gay person with a partner. Miriam recommends that the government of Dominica should amend the act to allow same-sex domestic partnerships.
The ways in which homosexual people in Dominica experience discrimination and have their human rights denied are often based on religious beliefs. It is not known how many LGBT people are there in Dominica, nor has any research been formally documented about their lives. Miriam would like to see a collaborative report being undertaken.
We want the government to agree to work on the production of an independent report on the LGBT situation in Dominica. This report will be prepared by an independent consultancy in association with the government of Dominica and the LGBT organizations in Dominica. We also want the government to be willing to look at the findings of the report and make the necessary changes to allow the LGBT to live healthy and fulfilled lives. Miriam is willing to take on the challenge of finding the funding to prepare this report.
In conclusion, Mr. Philip says,
we hope that the report that has been submitted to the United Nations in Geneva will add to the discussion to improving the livelihoods and lives of the LGBT people in Dominica.
To end, here are some voices from Dominica's LGBT community explaining what it's like to be homosexual in Dominica today. Their voices have been changed to protect their identity.
Well, I think being gay in Dominica is something that you have to be very cautious about. Being cautious in the sense of society hasn't accepted the fact of persons being who they are. I mean, although people have traveled around the world and know what it is to be gay and how to live your life as a gay person, it is still unacceptable in Dominica. You fear for your life, you fear for your job, you fear for almost everything, because persons on the street, they ridicule you, they call you name. Sometimes you go to places, they don't want to serve you because of who you are. And it's just a messed up situation.
Well, to me, being gay in Dominica, it's not that I have a problem with it, but to me, it's like, I mean, there is more that the powers that they could do to make it life a little easier for gay people in Dominica, because I think we're tired of hiding and pretending to be people we're not, and society or in Dominica itself is not a life we want to be. We want to be free like everybody else to choose to do what we feel like doing.
Being gay in Dominica embodies basically one word, invisible. To the average eye, being a lesbian in the Commonwealth of Dominica is just as easy as being a straight man. They say there's no real pressure from society, but this is completely false. As a lesbian in one of the most rapidly growing homophobic countries in the Caribbean, I have learned that I have no real rights as a member of the LGBT community, and barely that of even a straight woman. I have been the victim of sexual harassment, discrimination, and often the butt of a threatened man's joke, we like to call it, with no real law enforcement or protection for that matter. My sexuality and preference are not accepted here, but it's simply tolerated. My family has somewhat accepted my lifestyle, but always spilling the undertones that I should keep it private. My experiences and struggles with accepting myself in this closeted society has fueled my fight for equality and protection for the LGBT.
This production has been presented by Kevin Gregoire and was produced by Miriam. For more information, please go to Miriam on Facebook.